20 through 23. Are you willing to be shown proof, you foolish, unproductive, spiritually deficient fellow, that faith apart from good works is inactive and ineffective and worthlessness? So what he's saying here is, if you have, and he goes on to say it more than one time in the book, faith without works is dead. He says that at least twice in his. So what he's saying is, if we have faith, though, and it doesn't produce anything, it don't help nobody. It ain't even helping us if we ain't allowing the Spirit to work through us. So it's nothing, really. I mean, the evidence of our faith is through what the Spirit carries us to do, is what he's saying. And if the Spirit ain't carrying us to do any good works, if we ain't being led, then where is our faith at? Because it ain't showing nothing. What he was dealing with at this time was people proclaiming faith, but then they just were. They wasn't. Maybe they didn't live exactly like the world around them, but they didn't do anything to be a light in the world either. It's kind of like they were the people who put their light under a bushel. They were probably more concerned trying to get along with everybody and everything. Although they had their faith, people wouldn't have known it, because they didn't act the way they should. Was not our forefather Abraham shown to be justified, made acceptable to God by his works, when he brought to the altar as an offering his own son Isaac? Now there's a mirror between this story and what God and Jesus dying on the cross. But the point he's making isn't that. Abraham had to sacrifice to show his faith, to be accorded as righteous, considered righteous. And you see in the Hebrews, the Hall of Faith, it always mentions something that they did to show that they had faith. The Scripture is full of stories of men of faith who actually do something. Because when we have faith, it produces, God uses it to allow us to do something. And James ain't telling these people what that something should be. He's just saying that if you got God leading you and you got faith, then something should happen as a result. Everything's there to make something happen. And the fact that nothing ain't happening shows a lack of faith, or lack of... Because if we have faith in God and we are just willing, something's going on. He's going to do something. Because Abraham was just... You look at the earlier part of that in Genesis 12. Abraham was just called simply because he had faith. And simply at that point, I think he was just a man denying all the pagan worship that was around him, being devout to God, and that was pretty much it. But God called him to a closer walk, called him to the promised land and all this, and gave him blessing because of his faith. And while we don't follow God for the blessing, just getting that closeness to him will pour out blessing to us because of the faith. Although Abraham clearly had to give up and sacrifice, and in Hebrews we see that even though he was planning on putting his son to death like God had him, God ended up sparing Isaac. But Abraham believed, because Isaac was a promised child, so through him, God's promise of many generations was to be happening. And Abraham believed that enough that he would, after Isaac was passed, that God would bring him up from the dead to keep that promise. So sometimes faith is just acting even when we have doubt, and just trusting God to make the best of it. You see that his faith was cooperating with his works, and his faith was completed and reached its supreme expression when he implemented it by good works. So God was proud and happy with Abraham because And it also showed that nothing in Abraham's life was more important than his fellowship with God. Because if anything Abraham would have made an idol, it would have been his son, because he waited so long for it. But God came first. And that's what the whole test was about. God already knew Abraham put him first. But sometimes God allows us to be tested so we know. Because God knows our heart better than us, but sometimes we don't know necessarily where we stand until we're tested for our faith. Right. And afterwards we realize, okay. And then glory goes to God for making it, developing us and growing us in that way. I don't think Abraham had an attitude after he sacrificed Isaac. He had the attitude, yeah, I knew this was going to go right. I say he was probably praising God. But sometimes through actions of our works, we get that attitude that's boastful, and that's just as dangerous as not being used to do the work to begin with, because it's the wrong spirit behind it. And so the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed in, adhered to, trusted in, and relied on God, and this was accounted to him as righteousness, as conformity to God's will and thought and deed. And he was called God's friend. You know, for him to be called God's friend, this is highly favored. There's very few mentions of certain things like that in Scripture. I think it's Noah and Abraham, the only two men in Genesis that mentions. No, it's Noah and Enoch. But either way, there's very few people just called out from nowhere. Afterwards, we see it's descendants of Abraham, descendants of Jacob. God allowed Abraham, because of his faith, to set that, be used to set that. You know, God can still use us in certain great ways like that if we just allow him to produce works through our faith. Which means we got to keep looking to him and allow him to grow in us. Just do what he says.